If you've read a bunch of articles on the internet about front-end versus back-end versus full-stack development, and you still don't understand what the differences between them are, then this video is perfect for you. In this video, we're not only going to talk about the common things that you might see, such as, what are the languages and frameworks that you might see on the front and the back end, but we're also going to actually go through some specific examples from a web app that I built so that you can tangibly see what the difference between the front and the back actually is. Before we get into the explanations, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about, what we're actually talking about here. So when I say front-end, back-end, and full-stack development, I'm generally talking about web development. Now, I made a video right here in the top right corner that talks about, do you need math for programming? And although the title does not sound like it, we actually go into all the different types of programming in that video. And in that video, I kind of mention a couple of the main ones. So you'll have web development, which consists of front-end, back-end, and or full stack, which is what we're talking about in this video. And then we also have several other types of software engineers, such as a data scientist, a testing engineer, and even a DevOps or developer operations engineer. Now, there's obviously more disciplines than just that, but those are some of the common ones that you might be searching through right now. And so I just wanted to clarify that in this video, we're talking specifically about web development. And then the last thing I want to talk about before we actually jump into the video is salaries. Now, this is a very attractive thing to talk about when we're comparing front-end, back-end, and full-stack development because they all kind of pay a little bit different. But what I want to say about this is that I would not worry about salaries, especially if you're just starting out. It's actually one of the biggest mistakes that I made. I actually made a video about this very concept, but when I was first starting out, I was reading through posts and watching videos just like this one, describing the differences between front and back-end development, and the first thing that I was looking at was salaries. And you might see that back-end developers might make a little bit more than front-end developers, and full-stack engineers might make even more than both of those. But I wouldn't worry about this because I think it's really deceptive. If you're a solid front-end engineer and you really know what you're doing, you have just as much earning potential as any other type of web developer. The first type of web development we're going to talk about is front-end web development. If I had to come up with a personal definition of front-end development, I would say that front-end development is basically any code that's running in a browser. This is a bit of a loaded statement, but I'll explain through some examples. Now, when we're talking about front-end development, there's actually only 3 languages, and some wouldn't even consider a couple of these actual coding languages, but there's only 3 languages that can run inside a web browser, and that it would be HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language, CSS, cascading style sheets, and JavaScript. And these 3 languages are the only things that can run inside of a browser. When you open up your Google Chrome browser, there's actually a lot going on behind the scenes. Now, to render the actual pages, the visual elements on the screen, Google Chrome uses a utility called Blink. And to render the JavaScript, or to not render but compile the JavaScript, it uses this thing called the V8 engine. And there's also this thing called a Chromium project, which kind of ties all of these things together into what we know as Google Chrome. Other browsers have the same type of setup, maybe just a little bit different tools, but every browser is achieving the same thing, and that is taking those 3 languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and putting those together, compiling them, and rendering them into a visual experience for the user within the browser. And that is front-end development. Now, you might ask, why HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? And to answer that question, I'm definitely not the person to give you the origin story of the web, but it's kind of the question of how did we end up with Mac, Linux, and Windows as the main operating systems. Just like we could have ended up with 3 different operating systems than the ones that we have now, we could have ended up with 3 different browser languages that run in web browsers now. And so now every browser that you run, whether that be Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, Safari, the Brave browser, like all of these browsers run these 3 languages and are able to interpret them. But this video is not a crash course on browsers and that kind of stuff. So let's get rid of the jargon here and talk about what actually is front-end development. And in my opinion, I think that front-end development consists of 3 primary activities. The first one is communicating clearly to define the UI and UX design, or user interface and user experience design. The second one is creating an intuitive experience for the user so that they don't have to try to figure out how to use your app. It's just clear as to how it was meant to be used. And then finally, communicating with asynchronous data between the front end and the back end. Now, all 3 of these probably didn't make a ton of sense, so we're going to actually jump into specific examples of each of them to better understand. Now, let's start with this communication and the UI and UX design piece of front-end development. Now, this might involve some sort of graphic designer, or the front-end developer might do everything. But nevertheless, this is all about taking a user's requirements, or whoever you're building this application for, and understanding in plain English what it is that they actually want. So they may come to you and say, hey, I want to have a profile page where the user can click their profile and then they get a drop down where it says something like account settings, billing settings, and notification settings. And then when they click on each of these links, I want them to be taken to the appropriate page, and I want them to be able to edit all of these settings. Oh, and here are the settings that I want each of these sections to be able to edit. This is just one example of a requirement that might come from the person you're building the app for. The reason I think this is so important is because the front-end requirements that you come up with, the things that your end user asks for, if you can't communicate that clearly between you and them, and then also between you and the back-end developer, we're going to talk about that in a second. If you can't communicate clearly, then you're going to actually do a lot of duplicated work, and you're going to have a lot of changes that are going to take way too much time, after the fact. So I built this web app a little bit ago, and something that came up as I was building it was this feature here on the right. When I first started planning out this app, I had not fully designed these progress indicators on the right side of this navigation menu for the course. Now, this app allows you to take video courses from my golf website, and as you can see, there's these little check marks and the timers for the lessons that I have completed and have not completed. And you can see the 2 out of 7 complete and 40 minutes remaining is all linked up to the Vimeo player right here on the left. So it basically tracks how far the person has watched in the video and then translates that into whether they have finished the lesson or not. The reason that I'm talking about this here is because this is a very good example of how defining a requirement and not communicating it at the beginning can lead to a ton of work after the fact. Because I had not planned for this and I had not communicated the user experience, at the beginning, this took me a lot longer than it should have because I had to actually modify the database and a bunch of other stuff on the back end that we'll talk about here shortly. And if you imagine having 2 different teams, so in this case I was the front end and back end developer, but if I was the front end developer and I had a team of back end developers and I wanted to make this change, especially at a larger company, this is going to take a long time to actually implement this feature and go back and change the data models and implement it in the front end and test it and all that kind of stuff. Now, the next thing that a front end developer has to do, and has to do pretty well, is create intuitive user interfaces. So an example of this, we can actually look at this very app here. So let's make this a little bit smaller, and as you can see here, I have the same view, but now it's in a mobile device type of view. And obviously I can't have this, navigation pane on the right because it wouldn't be big enough on the screen. So I have to kind of make some responsive design which is a huge part of front-end development. You have to figure out how to design your web apps for mobile devices. But anyways, I had to figure out, well, how do I alert the user? How do I indicate to the user that they can switch sections within a mobile device? And what I decided to do, for better or worse, is use this little icon down here. So it's like the upside down caret and the right side up caret. And when they click this, it opens up a little dialog that allows you to change the section. And you can click a different week, and now it switches to that section, and you can click different videos within that section. And I chose this because it's actually somewhat of a convention within web development. This same icon is actually used within YouTube's mobile app to allow a user to expand the comments section of a video. So it's kind of an industry standard, and I thought that this would be relatively intuitive for a user to understand. But then again, it's just guessing. Front-end development is a lot about testing out your design, making sure that the users are comprehending it and think that it is intuitive. But this is a huge, huge part of front-end development. And the final thing that a front-end developer has to be pretty good at and understand is asynchronous programming. Now, what do I mean by that? If you are just watching this video and you haven't really programmed a lot before, this is not going to make a lot of sense. But basically what this means is data does not instantly transfer over a network. And when you're programming for the web, you have to take this into account. Now, we haven't talked about the back end quite yet, but the front end actually has to get the data from the back end to display within the application. And this data does not come immediately. It actually happens over the latency of the network that you're running on. Let's go back to my app here and look at the profile page that we have for our users. Now, this is the public profile page, and when we refresh this page, what you're going to see over here on the right in the network tab is a bunch of resources that have actually loaded for this web page. And you might ask, well, what's actually loading here? Well, this picture here, my name, the date that I joined, and the bio, I haven't entered it yet, but the bio, along with some of this other admin info, is all loaded asynchronously across the network. And it's grabbing this data from the back end and loading it over the internet or over HTTP. This is just short for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and is basically the way that the entire internet communicates. So you'll see here, this picture was loaded from the back end, and you can see down here, this is actually the picture that was loaded, and it's just a link that the picture is loading, but this link was stored within my backend database. And it took, let's see how long it took to actually load. Let's go to the timing of it, and you can see that the duration of the loading is all displayed here within the network tab. So this does not happen instantly. And as a front-end programmer, you really have to take this into account, and you have to understand how asynchronous programming, how things that don't load immediately affect your user's experience. You might have to actually put loaders within your application. So let's go to my statistics, my golf statistics. You saw that before this loaded, we had that little spinner going, and what that was there for is not for functionality. I didn't need to put that there, but it's for the user experience, for them to know that, you know, something is loading in the background and they don't have to see incomplete data, you know, on the screen. So I've kind of rambled on about, you know, communicating UI and UX design, intuitive designs in asynchronous programming, but let's just take a minute to summarize what front-end web development is. Front-end development is focusing on how the web app looks and works for the user. It uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, along with other frameworks like Angular, React, Vue, and a couple of other front-end frameworks. Now, these all actually compile JavaScript, but they are much more robust frameworks than just writing vanilla JavaScript. Front-end development requires strong communication skills and the ability to get into the mind of the end user and understand how that user is thinking. Front-end development usually requires strong design skills, but if you have a dedicated web designer, you just have to know how to code the design that they deliver to you. And then finally, front-end development requires a good understanding of asynchronous programming principles, as I mentioned. These aren't going to make sense right out of the gate, but they will come up over and over and over again as you do more front-end development. And now that we've covered front-end development, let's jump to the back end. Now, once again, if I had to have a personal definition of back-end development, it would be that it is any code written on the server side, which could be written in a variety of different programming languages. Back-end development has a much wider reach than front-end development, and you're obviously working with many different types of languages rather than just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Some of the languages that you might see on the back end would be Python, Ruby, C++, Go, even JavaScript. JavaScript actually runs on both the back end via Node.js and the front end. So this is actually a very unique situation. It's the only programming language that runs both on the server side and in the browser. And you'll see a lot of developers actually using both JavaScript on the front end and the back end, including myself, mainly because it just doesn't require as much switching back and forth between programming languages. Since we're dealing with a bunch of different coding languages and frameworks with back-end development across a wide variety of applications, it can get very overwhelming. But in my head, I think that back-end web development can be summarized with 3 primary activities. And those are database management, API management, and server-side logic. We're gonna once again go through examples of each of these just like we did on the front end so that you can get a better idea of what I'm talking about. Let's get started with database management. Now, in today's world where technology has advanced a pretty good amount and web development has made huge strides over the last 20 years, database management has kind of been abstracted away from a lot of web development. And although it is an essential skill that I think every web developer needs to understand, there may be times where you're actually doing a project and you don't have to worry too much about what's happening in the database. It kind of just runs for you. It's been hosted on some cloud service or something like that. Nevertheless, once again, I think it's very important to understand the principles of databases, whether that be a relational SQL or a non-relational NoSQL type of database. Now, this video is not about databases, so I'm not going to get into it, but the one thing that I will say in kind of how you can think of databases is the persistent state for your application. And when I say persistent state, it's just the stuff that, when you refresh the browser, it's still there. So the other type of state would be ephemeral state, which is the stuff where if you refresh the browser, it's actually going to go away. A great example of this is the Vimeo video player. Now, this is for my golf website, obviously, but if we go over to the description and we change the description here, and then we refresh the page and reload it, you're going to see that the description has not been updated. And that's because this is considered ephemeral state. And the reason that this is ephemeral is it's within the browser only. It hasn't been persisted to the database. So if we wanted to persist it to the database, we might say face on 3 would, and then we come down and click the save button. And now when we refresh the video, you're going to see that the description has what we call persisted to the database. So this is really what databases are all about. It's about saving data that you might want to show the user in the future and making it accessible to the application. Now, as a back-end developer, there are 2 things that you're going to be doing when it comes to databases. The first thing is you're going to design your database. And this might look something like this on the screen. This is just a database diagram. This in particular is a relational database. And you can see that this design has a bunch of different tables, and it's got primary and foreign keys and relations and all that kind of stuff. So you might come into something like MySQL Workbench to actually design your database. The second thing you'll be doing in regards to databases as a backend developer is connecting your database to your backend application and allowing it to be modified via whatever coding language that you're writing in. So again, I mentioned that I write JavaScript on both the back end and the front end, And so let me show you a quick example of how this might play out. So this is just a repository that I did for like my Passport.js series. And in this case, I actually have a database connection. So I'll go into the config folder. Don't worry about how this code really works here. I just wanted to show you a tangible example. And then this file right here, the config database.js, all of this code right here is actually connecting me to my MongoDB database that is either running on my local computer or hosted somewhere on the cloud. And when I connect it via JavaScript, then I can actually use it within my app. And you'll see here, this is actually my login route. So this is what happens when the user, types in their username and password and presses enter. It goes to this code block right here. And this line of code right here is actually where we're modifying the database using JavaScript. So I connected my app to the database, and then now I'm actually using that within the code. Once again, don't try to understand this. I'm just quickly going through it to show you a tangible example of how you might manage a database within your app. All right, I think that's enough on databases. Let's jump to API management, which is another huge part of back-end development. Now, we have this data in the database, and we know that the front-end developer needs to access that data somehow, but how do they do it? Well, the answer to that is through APIs, or application programming interfaces. Now, I actually made a video solely on this topic, so be sure to check that out after this video, or pause the video and watch it right now, where it'll explain exactly what an API is. But when it comes to back-end development, all we can think of when it comes to APIs, we can just think of them as a way for the front end to actually access the data that's stored within the database. So if you remember from this application here, if we go to the Inspect tab and go to the network, and then we refresh the page, and then we can look through this, but this one at the top is actually a GET request for the API, or the backend API, and it's asking for all of these numbers that we're displaying as statistics. Now this is what we consider a GET request, but there's also different types of HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol requests that we can do. So if we went over to the profile, we went to, general settings, and we set our time zone to something, and then we save and close, you're going to see that there's actually another request that goes on down here, which is called a put request, which is going to modify something within the database. So there's all sorts of requests that are happening from the front end and are being sent to the back end, and the back end is expected to actually handle those requests and update the database according to the data that they either received or the data that was just requested from the front end. I definitely don't have time to really get into this in terms of back-end APIs, but when we talk about APIs, we're basically talking about different routes or API endpoints. And what those are basically, okay, what is the link that my front end needs to actually make a request to in order to receive or update different types of data within the application? Let's briefly go back to this application that I was showing you just a second ago. And you remember how I showed you this router.post? There's another one down here, and you can see that they're actually at the login and register endpoints. And what this means is if we typed into the browser some URL.com, so think of this as your live API that you're running. This could be any, domain name. And then you say, I want to look at the API. Doesn't have to be that, but it's a convention that a lot of people use. And then I would say register. So if I use this link right here and I made a post request to that link with some sort of data, then this application that we're looking at here is going to say, okay, I've received this post request for the /register route, and this is how I'm going to actually handle that post request. And that brings me to the last part of backend development, which is the actual server-side logic that happens in your application. Now, to explain this, I'm going to actually show you a little practice plan that I put together for my golf website. And if you click through this and you answer the questions within the quiz, there's about 6 or 7 or 8 of them, something like that. And once you've answered all of those questions, it's going to load to this screen and it's going to ask you for your email. So when I type in, some email at email.com, you enter your email here and you press enter, it's going to actually submit what we call an HTTP post request, as we were kind of talking about just a second ago, to my backend server. And when I say server-side logic, this is basically what's happening behind the scenes when I click enter. And what I would expect after I enter my email is that, this website or this web app is going to actually send me an email with some sort of golf practice plan based on all those responses that I gave in all of the questions. So what's happening here is my front end is actually going to take all of that data that the user answered the questions with, along with the email, and it's going to take that blob of data and it's going to send it via a post request to the back-end side of my application, or the server side. And once the server receives that information, it says, okay, here's the email, this person is a beginner at golf, they don't have a lot of time to practice, okay, whatever all of these parameters are. And now I'm going to use server-side logic. I'm going to actually use code to dynamically create a practice plan for this specific person. So in summary, the front end here is responsible for actually collecting the user's data and then sending that data over to the back end, which is going to say, okay, here's my parameters. Now let me write some server-side code logic to actually process these and do something with this data, whether that be saving it to the database, sending a practice plan like I've done here, or doing a little bit of both. So there's endless possibilities of what the backend can do, but that's just kind of an explanation of how these interact with each other and what the main responsibilities of a backend developer would be. So what is backend development? Well, backend development, as we just talked about, is focusing on how the web app functions or how it works behind the scenes. It involves managing databases, whether that be relational, aka SQL, or non-relational, NoSQL, something like MongoDB. It involves writing APIs, and usually these are RESTful APIs. This is a term that you'll definitely stumble upon in the future. And backend development can use any coding languages, but some common ones are Python, JavaScript, Ruby, PHP, C++, Golang, all that kind of stuff. These languages could also have frameworks. Python has something called Flask, and JavaScript has various frameworks such as Nest.js. And all of these different languages can have different frameworks that you might be working in. And then finally, backend development requires some communication with front-end developers, but communicating is far less important than if you were a front-end developer. Now, I've gone through front-end development and back-end development, but what is full-stack development? Well, full-stack development is just the combination of the two. It's taking one developer and making that one developer wear both of the hats. So as I was walking you through the web app that I built, I actually built both the front end and the back end of this web app. And because I have done a decent amount of full stack work, I just wanted to lay out a few tips that I've learned along the way. One of those being isolate the different types of development that you're doing. So if you're working on the front end, don't try to mix that up with the back end. Don't try to work on both the front end and the back end at the same time, because it gets really confusing. You almost have to imagine that you are, waking up each morning and assuming different roles each day, and you have to isolate yourself into those different roles, whether that be front end, back end, developer operations, test engineer, all of those different types of software engineering. You have to basically know how to do all of this stuff and isolate that in your mind. And then finally, I would recommend having a plan when you start out your full stack web application. So in my case, what has worked for me has actually been starting out by designing web mockups, which is basically designing out how you want your application to look and even function a little bit when the user is using it. And I do this through Adobe XD, which is a really useful program for mocking up a web application. Once I've reviewed those mockups, made sure that they're where I want them to be, then I will actually design the database as best as I can. Now, this is not going to get all the way there because there's going to be some changes that will be made along the way, but it's going to get at least 80% of the way there. And then I'm going to pick a small feature of my app. So let's say the user authentication piece where a user can register, log in, and log out. And I will pick that small feature and implement it on the front end according to my mockups with dummy data. So I'm not actually connecting it to my backend APIs or database. I'm just going to have mock data in the front end so I can make sure that the visual piece works how I want it to. And then once I have done that, I go and design the API, which is going to help the front end communicate with the database, and then finally connect those up, and then go repeat these steps over and over again for each different feature of that application. So this is something that I really struggled with. I never knew what to start with. I sometimes would start on the back end, sometimes on the front, never had a real plan, and I would highly recommend at least trying out what I just mentioned or developing your own workflow as you go along, and make that a priority early on. And that's it for this video. Be sure to like and subscribe, hit that bell for notifications, and I'll see you in the next video.